this series of short lectures, we're going to begin a study in the book of Ruth. A young woman enters the little town of Bethlehem. She bears a son called the Redeemer in the lineage of David. Who is she? You might think around Christmas of Mary in the New Testament, but this occurs in the Old Testament. The book of Ruth is short, about 3 pages in most Bibles. It is intended as a story to be enjoyed. Read the book of Ruth slowly, pleasurably, as a beautiful story, and then read it again. Look for poetry in the book, themes like cloak and wings, bitter and pleasant, and repetition of concepts such as servant and blessing and fertility. Notice the heavy use of dialogue to carry the story. There's a lot said and unsaid in this book about God's work and timing. In some places, the right action appears to involve patience and waiting. In other places, the right moment is now, and human actions are suddenly quick and aggressive. The story says a lot about character. Naomi, Ruth, Boaz are all good models of character, especially displaying loyalty, compassion, and integrity. Ultimately, the book says something about the character of God. The authors of the book are unknown. Jewish tradition has attributed authorship generally to Samuel, presumably author of much of the Old Testament books of 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. The book reads like a story and was very likely a history passed down orally from generation to generation before being put into Hebrew text. Some general questions about the book. Why is a Moabitess welcomed into the Israel community? In Deuteronomy 23:3, we see some restrictions on pagans and Moabites, enough that that passage might indicate that even David and Solomon should not be considered Israelites. Is God punishing Naomi for going to Moab? Why do you think Boaz is so supportive of Ruth? How religious do you think Naomi, Ruth, Boaz are? In 2:22, what is Naomi afraid of? In what ways could Ruth be harmed? And Boaz seemed to have some similar concerns. In chapter 3, there's a fascinating night on the threshing room floor. Ruth makes a bold proposition. Boaz reacts in a certain way. If this is a chase scene, why does Boaz want no one to know that a woman spent the night with him? Why does Ruth slip out when it's still dark? How does Boaz know suddenly in chapter 4 that Naomi is selling land? Or is she? Why does the other kinsman redeemer in the story in chapter 4 not want to redeem Ruth? And in general, what role do women play in the story and the community? There are references to Rachel, Leah, and Tamar, and there's enough said about the role of women in this story and God's action with them that it has been suggested that the original storyteller may have been a woman. Why is this book in the Bible? In this study, I'm using an excellent commentary on Ruth by Robert L. Hubbard. Let's get into the first chapter. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. In summary, in the early days of Israel, a famine drives a man and his family of 4 out of Bethlehem into Moab, a pagan country. Man and his family are explicitly named, and they represent the main characters of our story. Naomi has 2 sons, just 2 children, but she gets to watch her sons marry and has hopes of grandchildren, but then tragedy strikes and her entire family is gone. Only her widowed daughters-in-law remain. In this fast-paced introduction, we cover a decade or more quickly, focusing on the tragedy which sets our story. Some questions out of the first 5 verses. How does the setting of the story relate to the rest of the Old Testament books? It's mentioned to be in the time of Judges. Why does this family leave Bethlehem? That name means the house of bread. Who were the Moabites? Was it wrong to go to Moab? How long did the family live in Moab? And not answered. Many of these questions are not answered. How did Elimelech die? Mahlon, Chilion. The tragedy here is more than just 3 deaths. Not only did Naomi lose her 2 sons and her husband, but she's lost any chance of descendants, of children or grandchildren. And Orpah and Ruth also. Elimelech means God is king. There is irony in this name, and in fact the book asks this question, is God king? Is he really in charge? For future reference, every time the NIV or the New American Standard used the word Lord, it's meant to be Yahweh. The original Hebrew word would have been Yahweh or Jehovah, the God of Israel. The god of Moab was Shamash. Ruth 1, verses 6 to 10. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them good-bye, and they wept aloud, and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Out of these verses, we see that hunger, famine once again turned Naomi around. Upon hearing that there's food in Israel, she prepares to return. But she attempts to turn back her daughters-in-law. Moab, by the way, was east of Israel across the Jordan River in present-day Jordan. About 50 miles from the fields of Moab to Bethlehem. Indeed, apparently from the east gate of Bethlehem you could see the fields of Moab. Many tribes had tribal gods. They were assumed to have power only in that land, so a traveler might sacrifice to the Philistine gods when he entered Philistine, and then make sacrifices to the Moabite gods when he entered Moab. At many times during the Old Testament history, Moab was in conflict with Israel. Moabites were enemies, not allies. This needs to be stressed. Not only were Ruth and Naomi coming from a foreign country, Moab, but in fact from an enemy country. According to Genesis 19, Moab was the son of Lot. These people were presumably descendants of Haran, Abram's brother. Here in these verses we see a unique characteristic of the book. The book will tell the story by dialogue. The word rest in verse 9 is an important one. It means security and stability. It was often a euphemism for the promised land. Joshua and the Israelites attempted to enter the rest that God had promised them by entering the promised land. And it's the same concept that appears in Hebrews 4, where Hebrew Christians are challenged to make sure that they enter into God's rest, a place of security. The Hebrew word for kindness in verse 8 is hesed. It has a robust meaning of compassionate, steadfast loyalty. At least one commentator suggests that hesed is the theme of Ruth, and the Hebrew word appears throughout the book, usually translated either into kindness or favor. The use of a Hebrew word for womb in verse 11 is unusual. There is a more precise Hebrew word for womb, but the word used there in verse 11 when Naomi says, "Could I have sons for you in my womb?" really means heart. In other places, that word represents desire or pity. It carries emotion. It's not just the womb, but the heart. Could I have sons in my heart that might eventually grow and marry you, is what Naomi's saying in that verse. Some questions not answered by the text. Does Naomi really believe that God or Yahweh is taking care of Israel? Why do the women follow Naomi for a bit, and why does Naomi send them back to Shamash? Although she sends them back to Shamash, she sends them back under the care of Yahweh. What do Naomi's words say about her daughters-in-law's chances of marrying in Bethlehem and in general about the role of women, the position of women in that time? Is God punishing Naomi for going to Moab? How is Ruth's reaction described at the end here? And we'll see if we move on to verses 15 to 18. Naomi says, return to your mother's home. Where is Ruth's mother's home? In the next short video, we will hear Ruth's final response to Naomi's urging and the conclusion of the first chapter of this little book.